Hi, my name is Rich Stalls. Welcome back to part 2 of the tutorial series exploring how you can integrate your Unity 3D projects into a learning management system such as Blackboard or Moodle using the Unity 3D SCORM integration kit. Now, today we will be looking at the basics of how the communication workflow looks in and out of the system here. So let's go to our overview. We're basically going to look at the overview of how the communication architecture works, inward and outward, from the LMS to the SCORM enabled build, the WebGL build that you will use, and also then how that communicates in and out of your Unity 3D code. And then we'll also look briefly at the kinds of information that can be sent and retrieved from the learning management system. So remember, this is actually part 2 of a whole tutorial series exploring how to get yourself up and running using Unity 3D and SCORM. And don't forget, if you haven't done so already, check out part 1, which is just getting started, explaining the basics of the things of getting the SCORM integration kit into your project. Now, I'm also very interested in how you might be using and intending to use in some of the exciting projects you're involved with on integrating your Unity 3D projects with a learning management system. So I'd love for you to pop down a comment, let us know what the kinds of projects you're working on, and get a bit of interest around those things there. So, looking at the Unity 3D web architecture, we are going to, let me just jump across to my screen here and I'll show you the details of a particular Unity 3D build here. So I've built a project to the WebGL web player target, and in fact I've also used the WebGL SCORM template. And as you can see here, there's 3 main components. You have the index file, there's a build and a template data area as well. So let's just go back to that diagram there. So we have that Unity 3D web application representing, I guess, the index.html file. And there are 2 parts that I want to focus on. There's the WebGL build, which is your Unity 3D project in essence. And there's also an included SCORM.javascript file that is actually very important to the communication workflow between the web build and the LMS. So let's look across here. On the right hand side, I've opened up the index.html file, and you can see there's a whole section on the WebGL content here. And that is where the WebGL content is included in the file. And just up here, you can see when you build using the SCORM template, it includes a couple of extra files, a SCORM simulator, which we'll get into in a later episode of the tutorial. But the SCORM.js, the SCORM JavaScript file, is the part that is vital for this part of your web build application to speak to the learning management system. So how does that initial web app communication workflow work? So you've built your web app and it gets loaded into the LMS as a SCORM compliant zip file. Now, there's a bunch of runtime functions that are specified in the SCORM standard that allow any SCORM object to speak back and forwards to the LMS. And this is done as a synchronous or real-time call. So there's calls such as initializing that connection, get value function calls, which gets values or information from the learning management system back into your SCORM object. There's set value function, which obviously sets some information, stores it back to the LMS, and a couple of important ones I just want to highlight there. Commit and terminate are actually quite important to finalizing a session with the learning management system. Now you can see on the right hand side there, next to the learning management system, is a student record item, just to remind me to speak about conceptually when SCORM compliant learning objects speak to the learning management system, they actually do it via this concept of a student record, where you have a student record which is set with some basic student data, quite often, first of all, retrieved from the learning management system when you initialize it and do some of those initial get value calls to find out who is the student that's run this this sort of instance of your Unity 3D app. But then you set various bits of data about that student record, and you store that back as a whole piece of information back, representing that student's session with the SCORM learning object. And that will become a bit more important as we look at how the communication workflow happens further in the session we're running today. So let's look at how, so that's how, we've looked at how the web app actually speaks into the LMS, but how does that communication now happen between your Unity 3D project and the SCORM JavaScript file? Now you can see here there's a couple of things here. Importantly, there's two main files. There's a SCORM API wrapper C# code file and a closely associated SCORM JavaScript library JSLib file. Now these are the two parts of the integration kit that really enable that outward and inward communication with the SCORM.js JavaScript library file that sits in the sort of web app space. Now you can see I've got two different arrows outward and inward from your project back out to the JavaScript file, because communication happens asynchronously. This means that unlike how you might be familiar with calling functions in a single environment, whether it's in JavaScript if you're a web developer, or in Unity 3D where you can just call the function and receive immediately in real time the results of that function call. Because we're looking at essentially two separate systems, on one side, the right-hand side there is your code, your project. On the left-hand side is that external web environment. We need to see the communication asynchronously. This means it's not real time. It basically means that you send an outward call using a function, and you mark that particular function call with a unique key or random number, as it's called in the SCORM JavaScript file, if you look into that. And it lets both sides of that equation, the outward web app side and the inward Unity 3D project code, know which function call they're talking about. So you send an outward function call and you sit there waiting and polling a wait for return function, looking for that particular random number key. And once you get that back, you know you've got your results back. So I'm actually going to jump into the code again here now. And let's see if we can explain that in a little bit more detail. So when you import the Unity 3D SCORM integration kit code, you get a plugins folder where the SCORM.jslib file lives. And in the SCORM and scripts folder, you can see here the SCORM API wrapper. So let's jump across to the Visual Studio editor here. The two important files we're looking at here is the SCORM API wrapper and the SCORM JSLib. So Unity 3D changed how it actually communicates in and out of a web app to use JavaScript library files. And there's some excellent resources from the Unity website there and documentation where you can have a look at it and get in-depth information how it works. Enough to say that this here, the function name in the JSLib file matches the functions that are sitting in that SCORM.javascript library file, JavaScript file, not the library file, the one that's in the web app. And you can see there it's got is SCORM 2004, and there should be a matching one, is SCORM 2004. We'll jump across, go further down, do commit. One of the ones that we're more interested in, for instance, is I've skipped past it. Is the do set value and do get value calls, which are, yeah, here we go. For instance, if we're saving information back to the learning management system here, so a do set value is the part that your web app calls. Now you can't call this JavaScript function directly from your code, you actually call it via this JSLib file. And to call the doSetValue JavaScript function in SCORM.JavaScript, you do so calling this function here. And you'll see that I've standardized some of the naming conventions to basically use what the JavaScript file in the web app uses, but just prepending the letters WGL to stand for, it's a WebGL function call. So this JSLib file basically is the bridge between, is a part of the bridge that sits between your Unity 3D code and the SCORM.JavaScript file that sits in the web space, the web app space. Now the SCORM API wrapper is really where that communication occurs. And as you can see here at the top, there's a few things going on. We import those JSLib functions so that we can actually use it in our code here. And there's a bunch of stuff that we'll get into in detail in some of the later ones here. But for instance, let's just go down here to a one of the functions we're looking at, the set value. So when you set a value in SCORM, you basically call a set value function. There's a particular SCORM identifier of the part of the data model you're wanting to store a value for, and the value itself. And as you can see, you build it and you call the function with that key, and then you wait for the return from the web app of that key. So then you know, okay, I've got a return value from the learning management system, and then you process it for errors in this case. Whereas maybe in the get value, you'd send the call outward with the key. You'd sit on that wait for return function, which basically polls a thread until that key is found, and then it returns your value. And then it's, for instance, if you're getting the student's name, get student's name, wait for the result. Once it hits back, then you can process that call there. So that's just a real sort of a basic look. Don't worry too much if you don't understand the details of it. Enough to say that the SCORM API wrapper.cs file and the SCORM JSLib file are the part that really forms that bridge between Unity 3D and the enclosing web app side of things. So let's actually go across now to the next step of how the Unity 3D project communicates out to the SCORM. So we've seen where that bridge occurs via, you can see on the left-hand side there, the SCORM API wrapper and JSLib file. Now, that is like a very low-level bridge between Unity 3D and the SCORM JavaScript library. Now, you could use it there. You could just call that set value function and manually set the string for the identifier that you want to set the value, and then manually set the value number. So you could do all of that, but it's quite a low-level way of communicating outward. And that's why the SCORM manager.cs C# file there is useful, because it actually abstracts a lot of that low-level calls into being able to set and receive data at a far more object-oriented and abstracted layer that actually uses the SCORM data model. Now, for instance, you remember how I was saying that when you're talking to the learning management system, you actually talk to it in conceptually using what's called a student record. Now, the student record represents the data around who the student is and what they have done and achieved in that SCORM session. And that's basically the unit of communication. And so the SCORM manager.cs file and the student record.cs file is that higher level abstraction where you can set and receive data at using the data model rather than the low-level side of things. So let's actually jump into some of the code to explain how that might work. Okay, so let's jump across to the code here, and we'll go to this. Let's actually start at the student record file here. The student record has actually been built around the SCORM data model. Now, I'm actually going to jump across to a website which I'll reference later, which talks about the data model here, and this is the kind of data that goes in and out of the learning management system. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later, but the student record.cs file matches this SCORM standard of what the data model is. So instead of you having to find out when you're trying to, for instance, set a, let's see something that's a little bit easier, set and receive the learner's details here. You have to know that the cmi.learner_id is going to be the student ID, and the cmi.learner_name is going to be the full name of the learner. And instead of having to know these are the things you have to put into that set and get value functions, the student record actually abstracts it out so you can communicate to the LMS in a object-oriented fashion rather than down at that string-based identifiers. And you can see here completion status. Instead of you having to know, let's just jump back across to that one there, having to know what all these bits and pieces might mean, and there's a whole standard that you have to trawl through to find out what the string, for instance, the string of a completion status might mean. We can set it here as a enumerated data type, and we don't have to worry about what's happening behind the scenes. We can just set and receive it via the object-oriented method instead. And as you can see here, there's a whole bunch of enumerated data types, and you can see here that there's a bunch of objects that bring together some of the data, the pieces of data to form a whole. For instance, a comment from a learner is a string comment, a string location, and a timestamp. It brings it together in an overall object that's a part of the student record. And there's a whole bunch of stuff here. Like, for instance, your learner score consists of 4 parts. And so instead of you need to knowing that each part is this string and setting, you can just set the learner score, set these parts, and you know it's going to talk in and out of the learning management system. So the student record forms the basis of how you communicate inward and outward from the learning management system using SCORM. Now, the SCORM manager is the one that facilitates that in a bit more detail. Now, I won't go into any more detail here. Enough to know that when we're looking at these files, the SCORM API wrapper and the SCORM JSLib files are that bridge between Unity 3D and the web app code using SCORM.JavaScript. The SCORM manager and the student record together are the piece that your code will actually use to speak to the Unity 3D SCORM integration kits. So it's actually the SCORM manager is the only, in association with the student record, these are the only 2 files you really need to know about. The rest is just, it's good to understand how they fit into the whole communication workflow, but you will be calling the functions in SCORM manager from your code to set and receive information to and from the learning management system. So let's briefly look at the kinds of data that you can send to and from the learning management system. So I've put here a reference, and I'll also link it in the description below the video here, to the runtime reference for the SCORM standard. Now let's just jump across to that web page I've got open here. And you can see here I was talking about, these are the runtime function calls, get value, set value, and it uses the CMI element to get and set values that we know. And here the data model specifies what those values are. Now, you don't have to worry about these strings because the score manager abstracts that out to the actual data model. So for instance, let's just find score. Okay, so here, when we're, for instance, if we're setting the score, we don't need to know all of these string references and what's the value is. We let the score manager abstract that for us, and we use that in an object-oriented fashion to set and receive the scores. But here is I just wanted to point out, this is where this is matched, and this information comes from. And it's interesting because here are the 4 parts that match. Let's go back across to the score manager. When we're setting the score, the scaled, raw, max, and how we had to set all of that there, that matches here the standard. So there's a bunch of things here. Let's go back to the top. I'll briefly overview some of the things you can set and receive, but we'll dive into what's possible using the SCORM integration kit in a later session. But this is where it is. You can set things like comments to and from the learners, comments to and from the learning management system itself, which would be the teaching staff member when they've set things up in the LMS. And some of these things aren't implemented in certain learning management systems, but the standard allows for it, and certainly the integration kit allows for it too. There's things like completion threshold where, for instance, if you need the student to achieve 80% to pass this activity, which gets set in the learning management system, this is the part of the standard here that says, okay, the threshold is a number between 0 and 1. It's read only, and it's used to determine whether the shareable content object, or the SCORM object, I just use the shorthand, should be considered complete. So the student, this comes back, for instance, the workflow might go something like, excuse me, LMS, tell me what the completion threshold is. You get 0.8. Okay, so 80% is the pass score. Now, when they go through the process of interacting with your SCORM application that you've built in Unity 3D, you might see, yes, they've got 82%. And then you would use this to set the status as completed. Or they actually didn't interact with any part of it, so we might actually set the flag as not attempted. Or they might have got 50%, so we'd set as incomplete. Typically, the workflow that I've implemented using the integration kit, the completion git status has to be set every time a student fires up your Unity 3D SCORM object. And you'll see later on that it sets by default an unknown flag, so at least something's set, and then it expects you to set one of these 3. But that is like a fallback that is set no matter what. So there's a few things there. You can see there's interactions which might match to, over here you can see it might match to some quiz type questions and interactions you're doing. Although in one of the projects I've used, I actually hijacked, because the learning management system that I've been using doesn't use some of the later tin can style APIs, so where we could set far more sort of descriptive and narrative style interactions between the learner and the web app. I hijacked this to let this was a nursing simulation that I used, and I used these instead of as true false questions. I actually set it as a performance setting and hijack this to allow the staff member to see where in the simulation that the students had been interacting. For instance, in it, they had to, before they interacted with the patient, they should have gone and washed their hands. And when they go and wash their hands in the simulation, I called this and created a new interaction object and stored it to the LMS, not around a quiz question, but they performed a hand washing exercise before they interacted with the patient, and that allowed the staff member to see not just how are they scoring on a quiz, but how are they navigating through the Unity 3D project there. And you can see there's a bunch of stuff on interactions, how long they took, and the results. There's a bunch on the learner preferences and information, and a bunch of other stuff there that we'll look at in later sessions. So that's it for this part of the session. Next one, I'm going to deep dive a little bit more, and we'll look at really into how you might be setting and receiving learner data and SCORM your SCORM object and the learning management system data, and also looking how you might set overall scores and completion, how you might interact with the objectives that might get set, certainly how you might store those individual interactions between the learner and your Unity 3D object, and the kinds of different scenarios on when the student exits your Unity 3D web application, what kinds of workflows are required so that the learning management system recognizes that they've finished it completely, or they've pushed pause and they're going to come back later, and that kind of thing. So we'll talk about that more later, but certainly look forward to seeing you at the next episode in the Unity 3D SCORM interaction workshops.